We have just passed an important anniversary.
We have, yeah. It's 4 years, Pat, if you can believe it, from the first death from COVID-19 reported in China. And I remember vividly myself, it was the 15th of January in the journal Nature, one of the big signs, respiratory illness, man dies in China. And does it feel like 4 years to you?
It does not.
It's a strange thing. 4 years ago, almost to the day, was the first death was reported.
It wasn't SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 at that point. When did you and I first start talking about it on the programme?
Yeah, I kept a diary. Strange, but during that time, mid-February, you and I discussed then for the first time, because reports were building up, and from now, I suppose, until mid-February 4 years ago, and then more and more evidence begins to emerge. And it wasn't even called SARS-CoV. I remember vividly, I could tell you they've now named it as SARS-CoV-2. At that time, it was called the Wuhan virus.
Yeah.
Or Donald Trump, the China virus. He was calling it in January 4 years ago, But then the real name became SARS-CoV-2, of course.
Yeah. And we still really haven't got to the bottom of where it came from, the market or the lab.
No, they've done everything they can to find out, but at this stage, can you imagine? I mean, a lot of research has gone into this, and it's from a bat. I mean, we know that much. There's agreement. A bat had the virus, jumped into a human, and there may have been some intermediate species. But the lab question is still there. It still hangs over the whole thing, really.
Still hangs over
Yeah.
it. Now, there were many treatments suggested. You and I discussed, for example, ivermectin, which was, an agricultural product. There's news on some of those treatments, hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important part because we're looking back on it now and saying what worked and what didn't and how do we respond. And very early on, there was evidence hydroxychloroquine might work in a lab setting. And I'd worked on hydroxychloroquine myself. It's used for malaria, it's used for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So there was some evidence it might be protective of the lungs and the inflammation in a lab context.
And it does work for those aforementioned conditions.
There's anti-inflammatory effects in this drug anyway. And COVID is an inflammatory
So
disease.
they got a petri dish, they got some COVID, they interacted with hydroxychloroquine, and it appeared to have some beneficial effect. But
this is all long before the vaccine. In fact, labs were throwing the kitchen sink at this thing to try and find a therapeutic. But then, of course, the proper double-blind, placebo-controlled trials doesn't work. It doesn't have a protective effect. But the paper this week, Pat, has just come out saying if you take it and you have COVID, there's 11% mortality. So it makes things much worse, and that's
so
even
you're
more sobering.
likely to die if you
take
hydroxychloroquine.
hydroxychloroquine. Yeah, and this paper slams into Donald Trump, because as you may remember, very early on he was a massive advocate for hydroxychloroquine. He said this could be the answer, and he was pressing for it on TV a lot, before the evidence was there that it would work. And the paper makes a very serious point, because if you listen to someone like Donald Trump saying take a medicine, it could actually be harmful until it's been tested properly. And of course, you need a proper double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And then when that was done with hydroxychloroquine, it didn't work. And now when you dig into the data, it's actually harmful to a certain number of people.
And of course, he was the one who advocated drinking bleach, because if it kills all known germs when you use it on your bathroom floor.
He did. Remember that famous speech he made? And you could see Birx, the medical woman, her face was falling as he was saying, inject yourself with bleach. And then even more seriously, when he was on TV saying take hydroxychloroquine, there's a cleaning fluid for fish tanks that has chloroquine in it, and a man drank some of that and he died. So that's the serious consequences of these things. And this paper makes a very strong case to say, well, look, hang on a minute, these things can be hazardous until they're tested properly. And then when it's done properly, sadly, because there was hope it might work, as you say, in the lab, but sadly, once it's done properly, it doesn't have any effect and can actually be dangerous.
No, I remember you had a pal who was working on ivermectin.
Yeah.
And there's news out about that too. That didn't kill people. It didn't add to mortality, but it didn't
work.
Good.
Yeah, that was a big one. And lots of people were pressing for ivermectin. And it became a big sort of issue among anti-vaccine people, for instance. Take ivermectin. They were accusing drug companies of repressing its use in various ways.
Because it was out of patent. It was easy to make, cheap to make.
Works great for worms, Pat, by the way. It really works for parasitic worms, you see. And again, in the lab, let's start off. It did work in the lab, like we just said, in a test tube. It seemed to be doing something, But again, several big trials, no effect, no benefit from ivermectin either. So that could be struck off the list as well as a possible therapeutic.
Now, we did have therapeutics ultimately that worked. And I mean, these were really bizarre words to us at the time, dexamethasone and remdesivir. Did they work?
Well, there is good news here, Pat, because some things definitely worked. And now if you're in hospital with severe COVID and you're at a high risk, you can be given these things and they will protect you. And that's one reason why the death rate's gone down, by the way, because in hospitals now they can treat people. And dexamethasone early on, that's anti-inflammatory. That was shown to bring benefits. A big one was Paxlovid. That was antiviral. Pfizer discovered that drug, and that kills the virus. That works as well. If you're in hospital now in Ireland, you'll be given these drugs if you're at risk of having severe disease. And then another one is an antibody called Sotrovimab. Yeah, these names are awful. But again, we end up with 5 or 6 treatments now that do have benefits to people in hospital. And that's great because, again, if you and guess who they're given to have? The unvaccinated would be at very high risk of severe disease. They're the ones who would be open to being given these therapies, which is good because obviously doctors will save people's lives with these approaches.
Now, then we had, and it was week after week, we were following the news of AstraZeneca and then Pfizer, Moderna, and then there was the Chinese vaccines, the Russian vaccines, and so on. What's the vaccine story?
Well, again, now the evidence, what's good is, Pat, the science continues, remember, to look at all this constantly. And the WHO, it's a big week this week for COVID in a way, because the WHO has announced 1.4 million lives saved in Europe with these vaccines.
In Europe alone?
In Europe alone, 1.4 million lives were saved. Mainly older people and high-risk people, obviously. You know, that's a great achievement, isn't it? Let's face it. And what I read about that was, let's say there's a war and someone has a weapon that could kill so many people and you can protect 1.5 million people from death, you'd use that weapon, wouldn't you? And that's what these vaccines were effectively. They were a way to stop death. So the statistics are now getting, confirming what we knew already, of course, from all the trials and experience. Yeah. Now we know for definite almost 1.5 million people would have died had they not been vaccinated.
Now, is there any possibility that the virus will change again and bring something that's much more virulent? And if so, would existing vaccinations be protective to some extent versus if you never had a vaccination?
Yes, I've just come back from a big conference actually, Pat, and a third of it was on COVID. We're still working on it, and that's a big question. Will it mutate? And we've always wondered that. Now, the good news is, even if it mutates a fair bit, you'll still have some protection because your immune system can fight coronaviruses anyway now. And this will be another type of coronavirus and it's in the same family and your immune system will recognize. You'll probably get symptoms. You might have sniff. People right now have symptoms of colds and flus. It won't progress into severe disease because at least there's some protection. So there's hope now, actually, mainly because of the immune system, not because the virus is getting more benign. It's more a case that your immune system is now well trained to see the whole family of coronaviruses and should offer protection against severe disease. And that's the current opinion on that one. But it's being watched very closely. There's still a risk, of course, of a really nasty one, but it's low now that we know the immune system can work, especially if you're vaccinated, of course.
So finally, it's all good news, but the lessons that we have learned and the technologies that we have created since 4 years ago, useful into the future.
Well, again, it's great at the moment. As you know, Ireland's about to have an inquiry, Pat, as you know. What should we do next time? And we know what to do. We can make a vaccine very quickly with RNA, number one. We have anti-inflammatories that will work against any virus. We can make antivirals quickly as well. But very importantly, from this hydroxychloroquine lesson, the hazard of repurposing drugs that are there. You got to be very careful until they're proven in a proper trial to work. And sadly, hydroxychloroquine didn't work and was actually worse.
Yeah, and AI is only a software. It's not in the lab with test tubes.
That's exactly right. That's right.
All right, Luke O'Neill, Professor of Biochemistry at Trinity College in Dublin. Thank you very much for joining us.